By the time Jake Morales walked out under the blinding arena lights, 40,000 people had their phones up, recording what they thought would be a train wreck. On the center stage of the Denver Summit Center, a young woman in a dark green blazer stood frozen behind a glass podium, her hands locked on the sides, her chest heaving like she couldn't pull air into her lungs. The massive LED screens zoomed in, and the whole crowd saw it at once, the raised, twisted skin that ran from her jawline down the side of her neck, disappearing under her collar. Laughter rippled at first, nervous and cruel the way crowds laugh when they don't know what else to do. Security hesitated at the edge of the stage, waiting for a signal from someone in a suit. Up in the VIP box, the man who owned half the buildings on that skyline sat stone-faced, jaw clenched, doing nothing. The teleprompter kept rolling lines of text marching upward while the woman didn't say a word. Her eyes shimmered under the harsh white light, the kind of shine you get just before tears break loose. Jake had been in the shadows, kneeling beside a busted stage monitor with a wrench in his hand when she first locked eyes with him, pleading, panicked, trapped. He shouldn't have moved. Maintenance guys weren't supposed to step into the spotlight, but his feet were already carrying him across the black stage tool belt, clinking softly, a nobody in steel-toed boots, walking straight into the center of a billionaire's show. Every camera swung toward him. A few people booed. Someone shouted for him to get off. The young woman's shoulders shook once like she was about to bolt. Instead, she watched this stranger in a faded navy work shirt with the name Jake stitched over the pocket walk up beside her and put his hand not on her, not on the mic on the edge of the podium, like he was anchoring it in place. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world. Jake Morales was 37. And most days his life felt like a long hallway of busted pipes humming air ducts and fluorescent lights that never turned off. He worked nights as a maintenance tech at the Denver Summit Center, the glass and steel convention complex where everybody else came to feel important. During the day, he tried to be both mom and dad to his 7-year-old son, Eli, packing school lunches, fixing wobbly bike chains, and pretending the overdue bills on the kitchen counter didn't scare him. He hadn't always worn a tool belt. Once, not that long ago, he'd been a drummer with a band that had almost made it small tours, late-night radio plays, a shaky promise from a record label that they were next. Then a drunk driver ran a red light on a snowy night and took his wife Lauren in a blink. The music stopped. Jake sold his drums, moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the west side, and took the first job that came with health insurance for his boy. He was good with his hands, good with systems. Give him a broken chiller or a flickering array of screens, and he could find the bad connection in the mess. Feelings, though, those he kept bolted down tight. Grief had taught him that if you let one bolt loosen, the whole structure might come crashing down. So he moved through the bowels of that massive building like a ghost with a toolbox, fixing what other people broke and keeping out of the way of the suits and the stars. The only place he still let music touch him was in the quiet hours when Eli was asleep, and he'd tap soft rhythms on the edge of the kitchen counter, turning the drip of the faucet into a beat. Eli was the reason he kept going, the reason he got up when the alarm screamed at 4 p.m., and the city outside his window was painted in the orange of another sunset he'd watch from a loading dock instead of a mountain ridge. On the morning the story really began, Jake's supervisor handed him a crumpled work order and a warning. The order said a VIP keynote rehearsal needed urgent AV support on the main stage. The warning was simple. Hailtech's launching their new safety initiative tonight. Don't screw this one up, Jake. The boss's boss's boss is watching. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans, clipped his radio to his belt, and rode the freight elevator up, not knowing that the woman he was about to meet, the one with scars she never asked for, whose last name topped half the buildings downtown, would drag both of their buried truths out under those blinding lights and make him step into a kind of courage he thought he'd left behind with his drums. Jake had walked into hundreds of rehearsals inside the Denver Summit Center, but nothing felt as strange as the silence in that cavernous hall when he stepped onto the main stage the next afternoon. The keynote lights were on full blast, washing everything in a sterile white glow that made even the dust motes look nervous. Rows of empty seats stretched into darkness, and the massive screens loomed above like watchful eyes. A woman stood at the podium, tapping her fingers against a stack of note cards. Her scar caught the light. Not the pattern of fire, but a ragged line, the kind you get from a car wreck or surgery that didn't heal the way it should have. She was maybe 25, maybe 26, too young to look that tired. A cluster of Hail Tech staff hovered near the monitors, whispering in quick, clipped tones. Jake recognized the type instantly, people who lived in spreadsheets and treated everyone below them like faulty hardware. He heard the words, "Make sure she gets through it this time, and we can't afford another mess." He knelt beside the AV rack and pretended not to hear. "Are you Jake?" one of the staffers asked. His voice was sharp, practiced. He didn't look at Jake when he spoke. "We need these screen-stabilized audio levels locked down, and please don't interrupt again. Yesterday was chaotic." Jake didn't correct him. He hadn't interrupted anything yesterday. He'd stepped in because a human being had looked like she couldn't breathe. But people like this didn't distinguish between chaos and compassion. "Yes, sir," Jake said quietly. "I'll get it done." The staffer walked away without responding, already talking to someone else about optics and deliverables. On stage, the young woman, her name was Kira Hale. He would learn later, flipped through her note cards like someone searching for a lifeline. She practiced her introduction again and again, but her voice kept faltering, cracking on nothing more dangerous than her own breath. Jake recognized that sound. He'd made it the morning he buried Lauren. He forced himself back to the task, calibrating cables, bypassing a burnt circuit, tightening the loose mount on a screen that had been rattling for weeks. "Hey," someone said softly. Jake turned to find a security guard he'd spoken to once or twice, a big woman named Maria with kind eyes and a badge older than most supervisors. She tilted her chin toward the stage. "You see what they're doing?" she murmured. "She's hanging by a thread, and they're all pushing her harder." Jake looked up. A tall man with silver hair. Kira's uncle maybe was pointing sharply at the teleprompter, lecturing her on pace and posture, as if she were a malfunctioning device, not a person. Kira nodded mechanically, rubbing her wrist like it hurt just to stay upright. Jake swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said. "I see it." Maria squeezed his shoulder once and walked off, leaving the weight of the moment behind. He finished the repairs and returned to the shadows where he was most comfortable. The rehearsal continued, and each passing minute tightened the invisible vice around Kira. She stumbled over a phrase. Her uncle snapped his fingers. She paused for breath. Someone else told her she was wasting time. Jake tried to focus on audio levels, but the tension pulsed through the room like an electrical hum. Every so often, Kira's eyes flicked toward the wings toward him, as if she remembered the stranger who'd stepped in last night when no one else had. But today, she looked away quickly, like she'd been told that he was not part of the world she was allowed to acknowledge. Around 4 o'clock, Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Eli's school. "Your son had a difficult morning. Can we discuss?" His stomach dropped. Eli was a sweet kid, bright and sensitive, but the last 2 years had carved something raw in him. Losing his mom so young had left a hollow spot that school counselors couldn't patch. Jake stepped into the hallway and called the school. He had a meltdown during group time, the counselor explained gently. He said he misses his mom, and that he's scared you'll leave on a stage like she did. Does that make sense to you? Jake closed his eyes, leaning against the wall. Last night, the blinding lights, Eli watching from backstage. God. Yes, he said softly. I'll talk to him tonight. When he hung up, he stayed there for a long minute, staring at the concrete floor, breathing through the ache that always lived just under his ribs. He'd promised himself Eli would never feel abandoned again. But promises were fragile things in a world that didn't slow down for grief. When he returned to the rehearsal, the room had grown colder. Kira stood center stage again, delivering her speech for what must have been the 30th time. Her uncle leaned forward, arms crossed, dissecting every syllable. Jake noticed something else. Her hands were shaking. The staff saw it too, but not with concern. More with annoyance. It's the scar, someone whispered behind him. People freeze when they're disfigured like that. The camera angles will be a nightmare. Jake turned slightly. It was that same supervisor from earlier, the one who treated him like equipment. The man continued without shame. If she can't keep it together tonight, the whole initiative launch tanks. And you know whose job gets cut first. Maybe ease up, Jake murmured. The supervisor shot him a look. Stick to cables, Morales. He walked off, leaving a trail of disdain in his wake. Jake flexed his hands. The comment wasn't new, he'd been talked down to plenty since taking this job, but something about it landed differently this time. Maybe because he'd seen Kira trying so hard. Maybe because Eli was hurting. Maybe because he was tired of rooms where vulnerability was treated like a defect. He forced the frustration down, but it settled into a tight knot in his chest. Near the end of rehearsal, the sound engineers asked Kira to run through the ending once more. She inhaled shakily, stepped to the podium, and tried again. But this time her voice caught. She faltered mid-sentence, lips trembling, breath hitching. Her uncle groaned audibly. For God's sake, Kira! But she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze had snapped toward the far left wing, where the spotlight's edge touched the darkness. Jake froze. She was looking at him. Not for rescue, not for guidance, just grounding, a human anchor in a room full of expectations. And before Jake could offer even a nod of reassurance, one of the staffers marched up and snapped at her loudly enough to echo, "If you want to embarrass yourself tonight, fine, but don't drag this company down with you." The words ricocheted through the empty convention hall, cruel and heavy. Kira flinched like she'd been struck. Her hand flew to her scar fingers, splayed over the raised skin. The shame was instant, visible, searing. Jake felt something old and dangerous climb up his spine, the same thing that rose in him when Lauren lay dying and doctors brushed off her pain when Eli cried into his chest at night, thinking he'd be next to disappear. He stepped forward without realizing it, boots thudding softly against the stage ramp. Before he could reach her, she turned away sharply, muttering that she needed 5 minutes. She bolted off stage, leaving her mic live long enough for the sound system to catch a small, broken sound that made even Jake's knees weaken. The supervisor wheeled around. Morales. Where are you going? We need you on audio. Jake didn't stop. She shouldn't be alone, he said quietly. Nobody should be alone right now. The supervisor scoffed. She's Hailtech's problem, not yours. Jake kept walking. He didn't know where Kira had gone yet, but he knew what she was running from, the weight of perfection, the shadow of family expectations, the loneliness of scars, the world refused to look at without flinching. He'd lived versions of it himself. And somewhere inside that building, a woman who'd been pushed past her breaking point was coming apart. Rehearsal had stopped, tension hanging like fog. The staff scrambled to rewrite cues and adjust lighting, while her uncle barked into a phone about crisis management. Jake reached the back corridor, heartbeat heavy. He didn't know what he'd say when he found her, but he knew this much. The moment someone yelled those cruel words at Kira Hale, something in the building shifted. Something in Jake shifted. Tonight would not go the way the powerful expected. Something big was coming, and the whole building seemed to feel it in its bones. Jake found Kira 2 corridors away from the stage, sitting on the concrete floor beside a stack of shipping crates. The overhead lights hummed softly, throwing a cold glow over her hunched shoulders. She had her hands buried in her hair, elbows on her knees, trying to control her breathing. Every inhale shuddered like it was scraping her lungs raw. He didn't speak right away. Sometimes silence was the only thing a hurting person could bear. He lowered himself to the floor across from her, giving her space, grounding himself, in the way Lauren used to steady patient present. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were red, but her expression wasn't just pain. It was fear. The kind that came from knowing the world expected perfection, while you were barely holding yourself together. "They think I'm going to ruin everything," she whispered. And maybe they're right. Jake shook his head once, calm but firm. "They're wrong." Her breath trembled. "I can't stand in front of thousands of people, Jake. Not like this. Not with..." She touched the scar before she caught herself, fingers recoiling like she'd touched something hot. "Not with them waiting for me to break." He leaned forward slightly. "Then don't break alone." She blinked, confused, but before either of them could speak again, his radio crackled sharply. "Morales, respond. We've got a major issue. Stage malfunction. Repeat stage malfunction, urgent." He rose instantly. Crisis tone. Not the usual maintenance nagging. Something worse. Kira tried to stand too, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "What's happening?" Jake listened to the radio. The words jolted through him like electricity. Main LED frame buckling, top bracket failed, panels coming loose above the podium. He didn't wait to hear more. He grabbed Kira by the arm, not roughly but with purpose, and started running. "Come on." "Jake." "What? No time." They sprinted through the corridor and burst back into the hall. Staff were shouting scattered across the stage like ants around a collapsing nest. High above the podium, one of the massive LED panels, the size of a garage door and weighing several hundred pounds, hung at a sickening angle, held up by a single groaning support bracket that bent a little more every second. The rehearsal crew scrambled below it, unaware of how close they were to catastrophe. Kira's uncle barked orders, furious. "Fix it! Stabilize it! Do something!" But the rigging team was on the far side of the building. They wouldn't make it in time. Jake didn't think. He didn't calculate. He didn't hesitate. He bolted toward the stage. "Jake." "No!" Kira shouted, but he was already halfway up the access stairs, tool belt slapping against his thigh. The moment his boots hit the platform, he heard the metal above him scream a high, sharp sound of bending steel. The LED panel lurched downward another 6 inches. Panic rippled through the staff. Kira's uncle leapt backward. A few people gasped. Someone yelled to clear the stage. Jake ignored all of it. His mind tunneled in on one thing, the point where the bracket was failing. He had 60 seconds at most. Maybe less. He climbed the rigging ladder 3 rungs at a time, his hands moving with an instinct he hadn't used since the days he set up concert equipment during his band's first tiny tours. Back then, it had been for passion for music. Today, it was for survival. The metal shuddered violently. Dust rained onto his shoulders. Jake Kira's voice echoed up to him. Not afraid for herself. Afraid for him. That mattered more than he wanted to admit. He hauled himself onto the narrow catwalk, barely 12 inches wide, 50 feet above the stage. The failing panel swung just below him, swaying like a pendulum waiting to kill someone. His vision tightened. His breath steadied. Muscle memory took over. He unclipped his wrench, jammed it into the warped bracket, and leaned his weight into it. The bolt resisted, refusing to turn. The whole catwalk vibrated with every movement of the panel. If this thing fell, someone would die. Maybe several people. Maybe Kira. That thought, sharp and sudden, hit him with unexpected force. He didn't know her well, but he knew her fear. He knew the loneliness in her eyes. And he knew Eli needed him alive. Still, he pushed harder. Below, Kira had made it to the foot of the ladder. She braced her hands on the metal rails, staring up at him, with her heart in her throat. "Jake," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her from that height. "Please." His wrench slipped. The bracket dropped another inch. The panel swung violently, slamming into the catwalk with a deafening clang that rattled through his bones. A chorus of screams erupted below. Jake gripped the railing to keep from being thrown off. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, but beneath it was something else. A memory. Lauren's voice. Soft. Laughing. The day he'd first built Eli's crib. "You've always fixed things, Jake. It's who you are. One day someone will need that part of you more than you know." He didn't know she'd be right like this. Not with a building full of people. Not with a young woman who looked like she'd been fighting alone for far too long. He planted his feet, repositioned the wrench, and threw his entire weight into the bolt. The metal screamed. Then finally, blessedly, it shifted. Half a turn. Another. The bolt locked. The panel's swing slowed, stabilized. Jake tightened the emergency clamp and secured the second bracket in place. When he was sure, absolutely sure, that nothing else would fail, he slumped against the railing, breathless. Below, the silence was enormous. People stared up at him, wide-eyed, stunned. The same staff who had dismissed him an hour ago now looked like they were seeing him for the first time. Kira covered her mouth with both hands, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from fear now, but relief. Jake climbed down slowly, legs shaking with leftover adrenaline. When his boots touched the stage, Kira ran to him, then stopped herself, hovering just a step away, overwhelmed, but trying to respect his space. "Jake," she breathed. "You, if that had fallen." "It didn't," he said, voice rough but steady. Around them, the crew murmured in shock. Her uncle stared at Jake like he was something he couldn't categorize, a maintenance guy who shouldn't have mattered, suddenly standing there as the only reason his niece hadn't been killed. Security guards exchanged looks. The showrunner typed furiously into her phone, probably already reporting what she'd witnessed to someone higher up. But Kira didn't care about any of them. She only cared about Jake. And Jake, despite the pounding in his chest, despite the wobble in his knees, despite knowing he'd probably get chewed out for climbing the rigging without clearance, felt something shift. The power dynamic, the perception in the room, the direction of the entire story. Kira whispered, "You saved me." Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. Everyone in that hall had already heard the truth. The maintenance guy nobody noticed had just saved the company's future, and the life of the woman who'd been treated like its flaw. And for the first time, the powerful didn't look untouchable. Jake did. When Jake stepped off the last rung of the ladder, the room didn't erupt, not with applause, not with gratitude, not with anger. It simply froze. The entire stage crew, the Hailtech staff, the execs in suits clustered near the monitors, every single one of them stood suspended between disbelief and recognition, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The LED panel above had stopped swaying. The catastrophic clatter had faded, but the memory of how close it had come still echoed like thunder in everyone's bones. Jake wiped his palms on his work pants. His legs trembled in quiet aftershock, the kind that arrives not during the danger, but after your mind finally understands how close the edge was. He forced a steady breath, hoping no one noticed the shake. Kira did. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have risked your life for this." He didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, but because he'd never been good at explaining why he stepped into chaos. He just did. Always had. Her uncle approached next, straightening his suit jacket as if dressing up his pride. His jaw twitched. "That was reckless," he said. "If you'd fallen the liability." One of the stagehands cut him off. "Sir, with respect, if he hadn't acted, we'd be calling emergency services right now." People murmured agreement, shifting uncomfortably. Eyes drifted toward Jake with a new kind of attention, not the dismissive glance reserved for a maintenance worker, but something heavier. Calibrating. Recalculating. Realizing they had misjudged him entirely. Kira watched those reactions gather around him like a tide, but her gaze kept returning to him alone. Jake wasn't comfortable with that kind of focus. He slid a step back, wanting the shadows. But the shadows weren't going to take him this time. Maria, the security guard, jogged up the ramp, her face flushed. "Morales," she said, hands on her hips. "I've been here 27 years, and I've never seen anyone move like that. You knew exactly what to do." Jake rubbed the back of his neck. "Just acted on instinct." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious, but curious. "Instinct like that doesn't come from a wrench and a maintenance manual." Kira's uncle turned sharply. "What does that mean?" Maria didn't answer him. She kept her gaze on Jake. "Rigging work, structural analysis, momentum control on a failing panel that size, that takes training." The words fell into the air like small stones creating ripples. Kira blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "Jake, what did you used to do?" He exhaled slowly. He'd hoped the past would stay buried under the rubble of his old life. But some truths refuse to stay in the dark, especially when they're the reason you can hold up a collapsing world. "I toured," he said finally, eyes drifting to the catwalk he'd just climbed. "With a band. Years ago." Her uncle scoffed. "You expect us to believe that a drummer suddenly knows high-level rigging? This is a corporate event, not a garage show." Jake lifted his gaze and met the man's eyes calmly. "I wasn't always the drummer." Kira watched him with soft, steady interest. Jake continued, voice low but clear. "When you're small time, you don't have a crew. You load your own gear, build your own scaffolding, fix your own lighting rigs. You learn every bolt, every lock, every safety line. And you learn it fast because if something falls, it falls on your people." The silence deepened. Not hostile, just absorbing. Maria's expression softened into something like respect. That explains it. But the reveal was far from over. A voice called from the back of the hall. High and young Dad Eli barreled onto the stage, cheeks flushed from running, latching onto Jake's leg with small, desperate arms. "Dad, I saw the screen. Mr. Collins said it almost crashed on everybody. Are you okay?" Jake picked him up, holding him tight. He kept his own voice steady for his boy. "Yeah, buddy, I'm okay." The crew watched the scene with a different kind of stillness. A moment ago, Jake was a nameless tech. Now he stood center stage as something far more complicated, a father, a man with a past, someone whose courage was stitched into the quiet parts of his life. Kira took a slow step toward him. Her uncle instinctively reached out to stop her, but she brushed his arm away. "Jake," she said gently, "you didn't just save equipment, you saved people." She looked up at him like she was seeing him for the very first time. Her uncle cleared his throat sharply. "Okay, enough. We appreciate the intervention, but there are protocols, liability concerns. We need to get back on script. The launch is tonight, and we can't afford distractions." Kira turned on him. "A distraction," she said, incredulous. "A man saved lives in front of you, and all you can think about is optics." He shouldn't have interfered, her uncle snapped. "He acted because nobody else could," he replied. The tension thickened, charged, and unmistakable. Other staff shifted uneasily. A woman from marketing whispered to her colleague, "Honestly, he did more in 5 minutes than the whole safety team." Someone else murmured, "He didn't even hesitate." Who does that? The power dynamic was changing in real time, and everyone felt it. Her uncle tried again, voice clipped. This maintenance employee can't just insert himself into critical operations." Jake finally spoke, his tone calm, but edged with something resolute. "I didn't insert myself. I prevented a disaster." Maria muttered under her breath. "Amen to that." Kira looked between her uncle and Jake, then squared her shoulders, emotion surprisingly strong for someone who'd been trembling an hour earlier. "I want him here," she said. "What?" her uncle barked. "Kira, you don't just—" "He stays," she repeated louder. "If I'm going to give the keynote tonight, I want someone backing me up who doesn't treat me like a liability." Her uncle floundered, stunned that she would defy him. But the room was no longer on his side, not after Jake had revealed everything unspoken about himself, his training, his instinct, his willingness to step into danger without fanfare. Kira took another breath, gathering more strength than she'd shown all week. "You all want me to sell Hailtech as a company that protects people, then start by listening to the one person in this room who actually did." Eli tugged Jake's collar. "Dad, what's happening?" Jake didn't answer right away. His heart hammered in the place where old dreams used to live. He hadn't stepped on a stage in years, not for music, not for speeches, not for anything beyond broken cables and burnt fuses. Now he was being asked to stand on one for something much bigger. Her uncle stiffened, jaw clenching. "Fine," he said bitterly, conceding. "If you insist on having him up here tonight, then he's responsible for the safety demonstration. Liability falls on him." Jake frowned. "What demonstration?" The showrunner stepped forward, tablet in hand. "The keynote includes a live safety launch, a demonstration of our new emergency protocols." She swallowed, almost embarrassed. "We didn't expect to actually need an expert." "Now we do." Kira met Jake's eyes. "Would you help me?" Her voice was clear, steady, no tremor. The hall waited. This was the new turning point, the moment that would shape not just the night, but everything that came after. Jake considered the room filled with people who had dismissed him, judged him, underestimated him. He considered his son clinging to him, eyes still shimmering with fear. He considered Kira standing tall in her scarred courage, asking for someone to trust. Then he nodded once. "I'll help you." Relief washed over Kira like warm sunlight. Her uncle stared at Jake, realizing too late that the man he'd called a distraction had just been placed at the very center of the company's most public event. And from somewhere deep in the crowd, half awe, half disbelief, a voice whispered what everyone else had been thinking. "Who is this guy?" The minutes after Jake agreed to stand beside Kira felt strangely quiet, as if the whole building were pausing to realign itself. The same people who'd brushed past him for years now watched him with an unfamiliar expression, respect, or maybe the uneasy realization that they'd overlooked someone who had been carrying more strength than any resume could show. Kira's uncle, still shaken from the near accident, offered a stiff nod. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but the edge in his voice had softened. "We'll revise tonight's program," he said, eyes flicking away. "Your expertise is needed." Jake didn't gloat. He didn't even feel vindicated. He just felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. But this weight didn't hurt. It felt right. Kira stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Thank you for not letting me fall apart," she said. "And thank you for not letting that panel fall on anyone." He offered a small smile. "You were never the danger, just the one carrying all the blame." For the first time since he'd met her, she held her chin high, scar and all. That evening, during the keynote, Jake stood discreetly at the side of the stage, ready for the demonstration. The audience didn't see a maintenance worker. They saw the man who had stabilized a failing structure with his bare hands. Kira saw him from the podium, and something in her posture changed. She spoke with a steadiness that had been absent all week. When she stumbled on a word, she looked toward Jake instead of the executives, and the line flowed easily from her lips. The presentation ended with an unexpected moment. Kira paused, thanked the audience, then added, "Real. Safety doesn't come from technology alone. It comes from people who act when it matters." Tonight, one of HaleTech's own reminded me of that. A spotlight swung softly, respectfully toward Jake. He froze, heat rising in his face, but the room erupted in applause. And for the first time since Lauren passed, Jake felt something warm bloom in his chest. Not pride, not accomplishment, belonging. Afterward, her uncle approached with a different expression entirely. "We could use someone with your background," he said awkwardly. "A formal position. Safety oversight, perhaps." Jake shook his hand gently. "I'll think about it." He didn't have an answer yet. He just knew he had options now, something he hadn't felt in years. Eli hugged him at the elevator afterward, little arms squeezed tight around his waist. "Dad," he whispered, "you weren't scared at all." Jake knelt to meet his eyes. "I was scared, buddy, but sometimes courage is just doing the right thing even when you're shaking." Eli nodded solemnly, pressing his forehead against Jake's. "Mom would be proud." Those words stayed with him longer than any applause. In the weeks that followed, everything quietly shifted. HaleTech repaired its entire rigging system. New protocols were adopted, ones Jake had insisted on after reviewing the flawed schematics. He didn't take the full-time job they offered right away, choosing instead to help set up the new program as a consultant while staying present for Eli. Kira didn't disappear into corporate shadows anymore. She invited Jake and Eli to small rehearsals of her revised keynote, sometimes catching Jake's eye with a smile that looked freer each time. She no longer covered her scar with makeup. She didn't lower her head when reporters asked about her accident. Instead, she leaned into the truth, painful, imperfect, unedited. 3 months later, Jake accepted a new title, Lead Safety Specialist for HaleTech Events. Not management, not corporate, but something he could believe in, preventing the kind of failures he'd seen too many times on small stages and big ones alike. Eli bragged about it at school. "My dad fixes the stuff that keeps everybody safe." And Jake realized that meant more to him than any album his old band could have recorded. Nearly a year after the near collapse, Kira invited Jake and Eli to a community center on the west side. She'd started speaking there once a month, helping teens with visible scars, disabilities, or trauma find confidence in front of an audience. She stepped aside after her talk, so Jake could help a nervous boy climb onto the small stage. Jake steadied the microphone, adjusted the lights, whispered encouragement. It looked like nothing. It felt like everything. When the session ended, Kira walked beside him toward the exit, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. "You know," she said gently when that screen was falling, "I didn't think anyone would come." Jake looked at her, really looked, and understood the fear behind her words. Not fear of injury, fear of invisibility. "I'll tell you something," he said quietly. "Nobody should have to stand alone in the spotlight." They walked out into the parking lot, where the sky was streaked with purple and gold. Eli ran ahead, pretending his backpack was a jetpack. Jake watched him and exhaled a breath he'd been holding for years. Life wasn't perfect. Bills still came. Grief still lived in the quiet corners. But he had purpose again. He had people again. He had a future that didn't feel like a long tunnel of broken lights. And in the soft dusk, as Kira's shoulder brushed his, he realized something even deeper. Courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it climbed ladders. Sometimes it held up collapsing weight. Sometimes it simply stayed when another heart needed steadying. In the end, Jake found that real heroism wasn't about saving a stage. It was about showing up for the moment that asked for your whole self, scars and all.